Good morning. I want to welcome all of you this morning. My name is Judy Lotzenheiser, and I'm a member of the Board of Directors of the Savannah Book Festival. And I'm sure you're thinking it's a little unusual or extraordinary for a board member to speak to you in between the speaker and asking the questions at the end of the session. But I'm here because of extraordinary circumstances. The cost of nearly everything in our lives has gone up, and I'm sure most of you have experienced part of that. But I'm here to tell you about the impact it's had on the Savannah Book Festival. Nearly 90% of the festival's income comes from sponsorships and donations. Over the last 16 years, the generous support has allowed us to provide Festival Saturday for free. We're incredibly proud of this gift, and we give it to the book lovers of Savannah and to all of you who have traveled from other places in the country to attend the festival. But this year, the cost of the festival, transportation, accommodations for the authors, venues, and tents have increased significantly, while our income has largely stayed the same. Unfortunately, this is not sustainable for us. Each year, Festival Saturday, we've always had the yellow buckets for books in the back for donations. And this year, we're making it easier for you. If you would like to make a donation of any amount, we have a QR code on the back of the program, so you can scan it and Venmo a donation to us. If you enjoy Festival Saturday just like it is, with dozens of authors speaking at many venues all day long for free, then we need you to make a donation in support of Festival Saturday. Thank you for your generosity, and please enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks. I'm going to introduce Roger Smith, who is going to introduce your author.
Good morning, fellow lovers of the Savannah Book Festival. My name is Roger Smith, and I'm a happy and longtime volunteer here with the Savannah Book Festival. This is our 16th year, if you can imagine. I hope that you were with me in year one. It seems like only yesterday. This year's festival is presented by the Philip E. and Nancy B. Beekman Foundation, by David and Nancy Citron, Robert Faircloth, the Courtney Knight Gaines Foundation, and the Gerald D. and Helen M. Stevens Foundation, with special thanks going also to a grant from Georgia Humanities. We're especially grateful to the Lemon Foundation for sponsoring this particular venue, the First Baptist Church Sanctuary, and today that sponsorship is in honor of Carol and Joe Young. This year's festival, as always, is full of great events and great authors, and we don't want you to miss any of the things that you want to be sure to put on your calendar, so I want to recommend to you downloading the Savannah Book Festival app on your phone, and that way you can remain in the know all day long and throughout the entire weekend. If you need more information about downloading the app, then you can find that information on the back of the printed program. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes, please. Our author, the first author of the day in this venue, Rachel Hawkins, will be signing copies of her books in Telfair Square immediately following her presentation. And I would ask your help and cooperation in not corralling her uncomfortably in this venue. I know that you'll have questions and so forth. There will be a designated Q&A time, and I'll tell you the details about that, but it's not really fair to anyone who's waiting in Telfair Square if we keep her here in this venue excessively. Please take a moment also, out of courtesy and cooperation, to check your cell phone to make sure that it's turned off so that we won't have any electronic interruptions during the presentation this morning. If you elect to take any photographs during the presentation, we ask please that you turn the flash off. On the back of your program, you're going to find a QR code for a survey about your experiences at the Savannah Book Festival. If you would take a moment to share your opinions, this survey is very helpful with the continuous improvement and to measure the impact of our festival, the impact that it has on the city of Savannah. Your responses are important to the funding of this and many other arts programs in our community. As Judy already mentioned, you're going to see volunteers holding yellow receptacles, and I want to urge you on my own, as well as echoing her sentiments, to do your best to be as generous as you can so that the events of the Savannah Book Festival can continue to come to Savannah and to be free during most of the stretch of the weekend. As I mentioned already, we will have the opportunity for questions and answers at the end of Rachel's talk. So when that time will come, please raise your hand. I will give some help to some of the volunteers in the room by pointing you out and trying to be fair to both sides of the room. And a volunteer will come to you with a microphone so that your question can be heard. And during the Q&A period, we really do ask that you be succinct with your question. Try to avoid making statements or telling long stories. Just get to the question, let our author answer it, and then we'll be able to serve as many questioners as possible. Rachel Hawkins, who is the reason that you came here this morning, is the New York Times best-selling author of The Wife Upstairs and Reckless Girls, as well as a number of other titles for young readers. Her works have been translated into over a dozen languages and then therefore appear in countries all over the world. She studied gender and sexuality in Victorian literature at Auburn University and continues to live in the state of Alabama. I know that you will want to join me in giving Rachel, in her debut visit to Savannah, a very warm Savannah Book Festival welcome.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. You know, it was funny. I was just saying last night at the keynote speech to one of my friends who was there, I was like, as people were wooing for Preston and Childs, I was like, nobody ever woos me. We need some woo girls, and now we've got woo girls. Savannah's a woo kind of town, though. So I am so very excited to be up here and speaking to you. Thank you so much for showing up at 9 o'clock in the morning. I actually texted my husband this morning, and I was like, I'll probably be talking to like 3 people because it was hard for me to get here at 9 o'clock in the morning. So this is, I cannot tell you how much I appreciate that. And also how surreal it is to be at the pulpit at a First Baptist church. My Grammy is in heaven right now being like, finally. She writes all those books with the F words, but at least now she's got this. And see, y'all wooed for F words. Thank you very much. I know I'm in the right place. So yeah, I'm so excited especially to be here in Savannah for, like I said, my first time being in Savannah, which is heresy, given that I am in the state right next door. I've been to all your other major cities. I don't know how I missed this one, which is clearly the best one. But I'm especially excited to be in this city to be able to talk about The Villa, which is my latest book and is a sort of very gothic-y thriller, and so it feels good to be in a very gothic-y city to talk about this particular book. As Roger mentioned, I've written a lot of books. I've been doing this. I've been published since 2010. I wrote a bunch of books for young adults before I moved into writing thrillers for adults, and I also write romance under the name Erin Sterling. So I like to joke that I have a murder book and a kissing book every year, and that's called balance. It's really nice. But The Villa is a particularly special book to me. It is my 16th published book, and yet it is still very unique to me in this way, which is a fascinating thing about writing, and you're probably going to hear this kind of a lot as you go to other presentations today. We all kind of come to this in different ways. You know, there's all sorts of different paths to publication and all of that. But there's also, every book is very much its own thing. I once had a friend say that all that writing a book teaches you was how to write that book. You know, and yes, there are certainly elements of writing that you sort of get more used to, or you absolutely, by your, 5th or 6th book that you've written, you're like, no, the book is not bad, and I am not stupid. I'm just 20,000 words into it, so I hate it now. That's just common. But yeah, every book you sort of approach differently. And The Villa in particular was a magical book to write. So I thought I'd let you know a little bit about both what the book's about and then sort of the process of how it came to be. The Villa is the story of 2 childhood best friends, Emily and Chess, who are both writers living in Asheville, North Carolina. Well, Emily's living in Asheville, North Carolina. Chess is a woman of the world. And they have that kind of friendship that I think a lot of people get into, that thing of you've known someone your whole life and you're very close, but you also kind of have a weird undercurrent of tension that you can't quite get rid of. And so Chess and Emily have sort of been in that space, especially because they are both writers. Emily writes cozy mysteries, but Chess is sort of I always say she's like a big self-help guru. So I was like, she's like Glennon Doyle, if Glennon Doyle was like a bad person. I'm sure Glennon Doyle's a lovely person. Although I did see someone was like, she's like Rachel Hollis, except less toxic. And I'm like, ooh, have you read the book? Like, Rachel Hollis might want to have some words with you. And so they're both two at very different places in their lives and places in their career. Chess is sort of shooting off to the stratosphere on Oprah's couch. And Emily is, very behind on her deadline, going through a bad divorce, having a rough time. And so Chess, in a very friendly gesture, says, why don't we go to Italy for the summer? And I have joked that I have so many writer friends, 0 of them have ever offered to take me to a villa in Italy for the summer, and is a massive moral failing on their parts, quite frankly. But anyway, so Chess and Emily head off to Villa Estes in Orvieto, Italy, to hopefully rejuvenate their writing mojo and also to sort of strengthen up their bonds of this lifelong friendship. The only thing is, Villa Estes has a history. It was the scene of a very famous murder in the 1970s. And as Emily and Chess spend the summer there, Emily in particular becomes very drawn to the history of the house and to what really happened that summer in 1974. So we also follow the 1974 plot line, which is where things get bonkers, and where I will now get into how I actually wrote this book. So, a thing you need to know about me is I'm a huge, huge literature nerd. Obviously, you people probably are too. I mean, we're at a book festival at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning, so, I don't have to explain myself to you people. And as such, I don't just love books, although I love books a lot, but I love stories about writers. Probably a narcissism thing, I'm not gonna lie. I'm an only child, it's in the blood. But I've always been particularly fascinated with the story of Mary Shelley and how she came to write Frankenstein. And if you don't know that story, I'm gonna give you the extremely brief version, which is that when Mary Shelley was around 18, she had left England in disgrace and scandal because she had taken up with a married man, the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley. Say that 5 times fast. And he deserves that name, quite frankly. And they ended up, so Mary, Percy, their baby, and also Mary's stepsister, Claire Claremont, who was married, couldn't get rid of that girl, ended up in Switzerland at Villa Diodati with Lord Byron, who was also fleeing England in disgrace because he had allegedly, probably, had an affair with his half-sister, and people were like, that's, you were doing kind of like fun and sexy scandals, and we were into that. It's too far now. I'm sorry, sir. And also there is Byron's doctor, John Polidori. And so, but at the same time, all these interesting big personalities who, again, have all this scandal kind of surrounding them back home, end up in this gorgeous villa. But at the same time, you have a weird climate thing happening. That particular summer, 1816 is known as the year without a summer, because there was a volcanic explosion, I believe in Iceland. My husband's a geologist. If I got that wrong, he's gonna be so mad. He's gonna feel it in Alabama and be like, no, it was in wherever, but I thought it was Iceland. And it meant that there were weird weather patterns. And it's actually a really fascinating artistic thing because that's, if you know the painter Turner, is his last, but he made these beautiful sunset paintings. He did those around the same time because the sunsets were so spectacular because of this ash layer that was, messing up the environment. But it also meant that these people now who had come for a cool summer vacation on Lake Geneva were stuck inside because the weather was so bad. It was raining, it was cold, and this was not what they signed up for. And so to sort of pass the time, and probably, again, everything's very complicated interpersonally. Mary and Percy are a couple. Percy and Mary's stepsister, Claire, have almost certainly had a thing. Claire and Lord Byron have definitely had a thing because Claire is pregnant with his baby. I don't know what John Polidori is doing except inventing the vampire, which is true. He's the first vampire novel he wrote there as well. And so Lord Byron says, hey, to pass the time, let's make up scary stories. That'll be fun. And he and Percy both tapped out really early. And then Mary was like, cool, I'm going to invent an entire genre, and that's what she did. And she wrote Frankenstein in that particular sort of bizarre hot box of again, very intense interpersonal things. that has always been fascinating to me. I love the book Frankenstein as well, like any good English major and former English teacher. I've read it a bajillion times. But the fact that, again, a teenage girl writes this book in the midst of all this personal chaos was so interesting to me. So this is like, I didn't, sit down and be like, oh, I'm gonna write a book that features this as a kind of backstory. It's just a thing I've always been interested in. I've read a ton of biographies of her. There's a wonderful joint biography by an author named Charlotte Gordon called Romantic Outlaws that's about Mary and her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft. And I mean, it's just, a thing I've been interested in. And so much of writing really is paying attention to those things you're really interested in, the things that for whatever kind of ping your antenna. But I hadn't thought about it kind of in years, I was not like daily fixating on this. And then in February of 2020, so right before everything went to heck, there was an episode of Doctor Who, a show that my kid really loved, and I love too, who am I kidding? And it featured that particular summer. It's called The Haunting at Villa Diodati. Aliens show up. I don't really remember the actual plot of the episode, but it kind of sparked like, oh yeah, I always really liked that whole thing. And then that was just sort of on my mind. So, and then the world went to heck, as you know. See, I'm censoring because we're in the church. No lightning strikes in here today. And I already mentioned Lord Byron. I'm on like thin ice. So we're stuck in our homes, and my husband, his kind of way of handling this, he built by himself this massive, like, covered patio for us. Like, literally, it was bizarre. He was just out there completely alone with, like, these massive columns and building things. And so once it was finished, after he had spent, a month building something with me, like, looking out the window, being like, is it done yet? I want to sit out there. He asked, he was like, can you paint, like, do you want to, he phrased it as, do you want to paint it? And I was like, absolutely, I do not want to, but you did build this whole thing, so I guess I will. So, and this is where I give a little bit of writing advice that I absolutely hate. I really hate that this is true, but I had a writing professor at Auburn, Judy Troy, who once said that if you're stuck on a book or you're trying to think of a story idea or whatever, do like really boring, tedious, menial labor, like wash dishes or whatever. That's something about doing stuff with your hands frees up your brain. But it can't be, you can't be like working on like an elaborate embroidery or something like that. It's got to be sort of menial. And I was like, no, I did not get into writing to like wash dishes for inspiration. That's not fun. It's so true though, you guys, it's so true, I hate it. So I was out there painting the deck thing, and I was listening to I have a Spotify like playlist of like 1970s sort of folk rock music. My parents were hippies, and so it's the music of my childhood. And as I'm painting, I'm listening to this 1970s music, and I'm thinking about that episode of Doctor Who that we had seen a couple of months before. And I start thinking, like, that whole summer at Villa Diodati, that would be a really good thriller. Like, that, like, what if one of them had gotten murdered? That would be, and then I'm like, yeah, but, I don't really want to do, like, I don't want to write the actual people, and I don't really want to write about 1816, an era that I'm not super duper interested in. And then the 70s music is going, and then I'm like, wait. What if I took those people and that sort of basic setup, but they're rock stars? Oh my God, they're Fleetwood Mac, basically. That makes sense, that all tracks. And then from there, so I'm just painting the porch, listening to this music, and I'm like, yes, it's Lord Byron, but he's a rock star, because he was, basically. And you've got Mary, and what does Mary Shelley look like in the 1970s? What is she writing? Well, there's a huge horror boom in the 1970s. You see, like, that's, Stephen King comes out of that and that sort of thing. And I was like, okay, so she's writing horror, and it sort of spiraled from there. So I wrote down like everything that I knew, which is how I always kind of start a book, is that my sort of process is, once I've sort of thought about it for so much of writing, and this is gonna sound like, you're gonna be like, that is BS, and you are simply, trying to excuse the fact that you spend a huge amount of time daydreaming, which is true. But a huge amount of writing really is not sitting in front of the computer or your, pen and paper or whatever. It is thinking about it. And so after I've thought about it for as long as it feels necessary to think about it, I sit down and I just start sort of telling myself the most basic version of it. And this is great too, because it really quickly lets you go like, oh, I don't actually have a plot, it's just vibes. That's fun. If you're like really fixated on like, and then they like just go over here and this is playing and the house looks like that, yeah, you don't have a plot. But I did have a plot. I was like, no, I see it and I see what I'm talking about. But I didn't just want to do that. I didn't, and there were a couple of reasons, both like artistic and commercial, which is like the sort of thing that you've got to do a lot as an author, where I was like, people that read The Wife Upstairs, Reckless Girls had not come out yet. I was like, people that are gonna read, like they don't necessarily want like a 1970s historical fiction thriller from me. So what if this is like the background story? Like now what do I do? What is my sort of front story? What complements this idea that I'm having about wanting to write both about, women and art and the act of creation? Because again, that's what's so interesting to me about the Mary Shelley story is that, Frankenstein is the ultimate story of creation. And she herself is creating, and again, this incredibly strained and odd environment. And so I was fascinated by that. I wanted to talk about the idea of sort of women as muses, especially in music and that sort of thing. So I had all these like big ideas, but also, and this is extremely important that you understand about my books, the main reason that like all of my stories exist is because I was like, that would be fun. Like that's like really like, that's like the absolute like deep level is just me trying to have a real good time. Which is also my life philosophy. So I have all of these like big ideas, but also I want it to be fun. I want it to be exciting. I grew up reading Jackie Collins and Judith Krantz and those sort of big, what they used to very derivatively call sex and shopping books, but they were fun. And like I tell you, you go back and read Judith Krantz and you would be like, wow, this is really good. Like they were really doing something. Sidney Sheldon, another one I was really obsessed with. And so I wanted to do something kind of like that. And so I have all this, and I'm like, okay, so like, what does the front story look like? And I have been really, really lucky in my career. I have a ton of writer friends who and we're all at, we write different things. We've been at different stages in our careers. And it's super helpful. I always say, especially if you're an aspiring writer or if you've just, are beginning the publication journey, it's so useful to have writer friends kind of on either side of your journey. So people that are further down the path from you, people who are not quite so far down the path as you. And I have been very like supported and held in those friendships. If you read the acknowledgments of the villa, you'll see I very quickly tell all my friends, like, this isn't about you. Like, this is me like working out my deepest fear, which is like, but what if those friendships were toxic? What if they weren't, as supportive and wonderful as mine are? And I thought that was like, that now really resonated with me for like a front story. Okay, we're talking about modern writers. We're talking about women, we're talking about creation, we're talking about ownership of stories and how stories change and who's telling them and the stories that we tell ourselves and all this kind of stuff. And so that's how Emily and Chess were sort of born, is that I wanted to talk about both female friendships, which I've been talking about this a lot on my Villa events, about friendships specifically, and that I think that friendship is one of those relationships, like it doesn't get as much sort of cultural weight as romantic relationships or family relationships. Like friendships are usually ranked below those things, but anyone that's ever had a friend breakup knows that it is every bit as traumatic and upsetting, as sometimes more so, than a romantic breakup. And I think that there's something very complex and interesting about friendships in that way, because as I wrote in a thing, they're actually, if you think about it, friendship is like a combination of both the best and worst of family and romance. Because, and again, anyone knows, when you make like a new best friend, when you meet somebody and you're like, I want to hang out with you all the time, it can feel very similar to like that sort of first like rush of falling in love with someone or having a crush on someone. And yet, we stay in like bad friendships sometimes, even though like the consequences for leaving those are so less than like, if you leaving in a particularly serious romantic relationship, you got to get lawyers involved. And if you're leaving a family relationship, your aunt is going to yell at you and ask why you're not talking to your brother anymore. It's none of her business. But with friendships, like you can leave. You really can. It's easier sometimes to just be like, okay, this isn't working out. And yet we don't a lot of the time because I think that those ties are so much stronger. And so I knew that I wanted to talk about that. And so then sort of a similar thing. I had my 1970s plot line pretty much plotted out. And then I had my ideas that I knew I wanted to talk about in the contemporary. And then it was just sort of a matter of weaving them together. And boy, did I weave, because I actually I started this book and I was kind of playing around with it. I don't write in order, which is both wonderful in some ways and terrible in others. My editor would be like, no, it's mostly terrible. Because, she'll be like, can you at least like send the first 3 chapters? And I'm like, I don't have the first 3 chapters. Do you want chapters like 17 and 18? I got that. But it works for me. I once saw a writer, Juliana Baggett, say that like if you have an idea for a scene and you're excited about writing it, but it's like it's not time yet, she was like, who cares? Writing is hard. If you're excited and you're really looking forward to writing that thing, then write that thing right now. What are you doing? And I was like, that is a game changer, Juliana. Thank you. So I think about that a lot. But because I write out of order, I had like little bits here, little bits there. And when it finally kind of came time to like really, it was crunch time, the book is due. The first draft of this book was drafted in 8 days because I felt like absolutely possessed almost writing it. And again, this is my 16th book. I have never felt this way before or since, unfortunately. I was up at like 2 in the morning the other night here in Savannah turning in the next book. And so, I don't know, there was, like I said, it always felt magic. Now, granted, like, the version that you have read or hopefully will read is not the 8-day version, let me tell you, because then we edited for another 6 or so months, something like that. But the book is so special to me, and then perhaps my favorite thing about it, though, is that I had written it in those 8 days. I was about to turn it in. And as I was reading over it, I realized that even though I thought I knew everything, and I am not super woo-woo about my writing. I am not one of those people that's like, my characters tell me what to do, and not for me. I'm like, no, I tell you what to do. And you're not real, you just live in my head, so can't tell me what to do. But in this case, as I was reading it, I was like, something's not quite right. And then I realized that there was another secret still in the book. And I wrote the last chapter of the book literally an hour or 2 before I turned it in. And that last chapter changes everything. The last chapter is the biggest twist in the book. It is, And I thought, how funny that I thought I knew this story. And of course, this happened in a book that's about books, that's about storytelling. Of course, my own story wasn't quite right and then had one last twist for me, which I really appreciated. Thank you, Mary Shelley, Writing Gods, whoever it was. Sorry. So yeah, it was just a really, really magical book to write. And again, nothing has ever sort of been like that. And as you can see, it was sort of born out of the weirdest, most chaotic and kind of messy process, but that's sometimes just how it works. And I will always be extremely grateful for that. Also, if you, let's see, no, it's not called that anymore. I was about to say, if you go on my Spotify, which is just under Rachel M. Hawkins, you can actually see the playlist that I made for it, so I had a playlist for the book previous to that one the book was called Reckless Girls, but the playlist was called Making Bad Choices in the South Pacific, which is absolutely the theme of Reckless Girls. And then with the villa, it was Making Bad Choices in 1970s Orvieto, which is also absolutely the theme of the book. This is also a special book too, because it's, I wrote, all of us kind of were like, oh, we're gonna write a book during the pandemic, and then things just kept going, and we were like, so this is now my second book I wrote during a pandemic. So Reckless Girls had been that for me, which again is a book that sort of travels you can very much tell that I was like a travel fiend trapped in my own home for 2 years because these books have just taken place all over the world. I wasn't able to do any like kind of hands-on research for Reckless Girls because I wrote it during pandemic. I'd never been to Hawaii. I'd certainly never been to Murder Island in the South Pacific, not its official government name. But in this book, I actually had been to some of these places. But again, in the weird way that writing works, I am not usually someone that sort of sits down and is like, I want to write a book about, XYZ. I need to visit this place, that's just not how I work. What I try to do is, travel and have experiences and turn that part of my brain off. I mean, you can never really turn it off. But I'm not like there being like, is this a book? Is this a book? That's no fun, and it really annoys your family if you do that kind of thing anyway. But this one, so I like to have these experiences, and then I always trust that the story shows up later. Eventually, years down the line. That last year, my husband and son and I went to Iceland, which was amazing and beautiful. And my husband suddenly kept being like, you got a book? You got to do an Iceland book? You got an Iceland book? And I was like, no, but I don't have an Iceland book. But I will. It'll show up at some point. And this was the case with the villa. My husband was teaching in Rome, and my son and I went over there. And, this is also my theory that hopefully not offensive and won't get me kicked out. So my husband and I always say that there's potato Europe and tomato Europe, and you tend to prefer one to the other. Like, people are either potato Europe people or they are tomato Europe people. As you can tell from my skin tone, my family and I are the potato people. So, and my husband is even paler and red of hair. So we go to Scotland and England, big potato place, and stuff like that. So when we were in Rome, we were like, this is like full-on tomato Europe. And it is hot, which is stupid. I'm from Alabama. It was no hotter in Rome than it has ever been in Auburn, Alabama. And yet we were like, so hot. There's an entire cemetery in Rome, the Protestant cemetery, or also the anti-Catholic cemetery, that we jokingly called like English people who came to Italy and got so hot they died. It's true though, most of them they could not handle it. And so we were sort of like weirdly not feeling it, which was like terrible. Like, it makes me feel so bad to be like, we're wandering around like one of like civilization's most amazing cities, and we're like, it's okay. It's tomato Europe. We don't even really like pasta. So, but on one of those days, he took his students to Orvieto, which is a sort of medieval hill town about an hour's train ride outside of Rome. And there, I was suddenly like, oh wait, no, this is good. Now I'm feeling it, because it was, again, medieval. It's very, it's smallish, it's beautiful. There really is, if you read the book, they go into St. Patrick's Well at one point, which is this amazing structure that sort of a double helix spirals down into the earth. And we did that, and I was like, okay, this is now the coolest place. And so when it came time to write this book, I think I actually pitched it to my editor at first as taking place in France. And I'd been to France too, but I was like, no, it needs tomato Europe. France, by the way, is both potato and tomato. They have a potato-tomato border. Please don't tell any actual French people I ever said that. Just keep this between us and, the big guy. So anyway, but it was so interesting that, like, again, I didn't go to Orvieto being like, I'm going to write a book about this one day. And yet, when I had this idea for a book, suddenly the place that I'd gone to was there. So again, it's just another way in which I sort of feel like this book, I don't know, it was a magic one. And so I definitely, if you have read it, thank you. If you have not, hopefully I've done a good job. You're like, I need to read this chaotic tomato book, which is probably what you will all go to your bookstore and say. This lady said it's green, I think. So anyway. So yeah, that's kind of the story of the villa. And yeah, if you guys have any questions now, I'm checking my time because I'm terrible at time. Oh, good. I am happy to answer them, and everybody's going to help and do the mic so that I don't have to point at people, which freaks me out. So. Oh, yeah. Yeah, no problem.
Our
Yes,
volunteers
thank
are
you.
making their way through. Why don't we start right over here, if we could, and then go, you want to start over here, but you're closer over there, so
Yeah.
do not. Sorry.
Thank you. This is very helpful.
Good Good morning, Rachel. That was a exciting chat. We enjoyed it very much.
Oh, thank you.
I'm curious with it. I think you said that Ville was your 16th, but that you've written in YA, the romance, the XX, and does your writing process change when you're writing in kind of the different genres, and has it changed over the years?
Oh, that's a really great question. I actually kind of wondered that myself. Like when I started doing like all, the romance and the thrillers around the same time, would it be different? The basics are not. I do have a tendency the romances I am more likely to write from beginning to end. That I will be more linear with, because in romance, obviously you still have to have a plot, but one of the important things, in romance you really want to be sure that you're prioritizing like the emotional journey of the characters, and you obviously have that in the thrillers too, but there's other working parts that you're dealing with. So with the romance, it's easier for me to do them in a linear fashion, because that way I can make sure I'm tracking everybody's kind of emotional ups and downs better. But that's really about it. The thrillers and the YA books were really the ones that I feel like I wrote like the closest, like there's really no difference, except for the aforementioned F words. And also just sort of making sure, I would say too with like thrillers, thriller readers are so smart and they've read everything. And so you're not gonna surprise all of them. They're gonna see what you're doing. But my thing is like, I don't always want to surprise, I want to at least satisfy, so that even if you saw the twist coming or whatever, you're like, nice, that tracks. And I really appreciate that. So with the thrillers, I do a lot more plotting, because I always say that I want my readers to feel at least one step ahead of my characters, and I'm trying to stay at least one step ahead of my readers. So yeah, so it can be kind of different, but it's nice, and I don't ever write them at the same time. I try to block off, I'm doing the romance right now I'm doing a thriller, just, for my own sanity, quite frankly.
Fourth row right here.
I actually had almost the exact same question.
Oh.
That you had to turn off, like, when you're writing thrillers, you turn off, like, the sexy time in your brain.
Oh, yeah.
And
Yes,
then-
do I?
Oh.
Yeah.
Hello. When you're writing the thriller or the romance, are you turning off the sexy time in your brain versus when you're writing the romance, are you turning like, oh, that went a little dark?
Yeah,
Like,
exactly. You're like, oh, there doesn't need to be a murder in this
Yes.
romance.
So it was
that
a
wasn't
very
the
similar
vibe.
question in doing that. Do you tend to
Yeah.
find yourself being like, oh, I went a little dark there. I need to lighten it back up?
Absolutely. That's a great question, because it's very true. Yes, like sometimes in my romances, I'm like, yeah, is this plot point a little too murdery? Is it a little... Especially because my romances have like an element, they're witchy romances, there's magic and that kind of thing in them. And so there's a real, yes, you can go too dark. And I have joked that my thrillers are, I think, getting progressively sexier as a result. The one that I just turned in at 2 a.m. the other day is actually, to me, like my first kind of take on a thriller romance. It's like there's a love story in it that I think is really lovely, but it's extremely twisted at the same time. So yeah, they're definitely kind of bleeding into each other, but I think all to the good, really. I think it's making both books better to sort of have both parts of my mind turned on. Yeah.
There's a gentleman sort of 3/4 of the way back who can be next.
Again, this is like taking the pressure off me so much, because like the pointing at people with, I'm like, oh God.
You're doing this.
Yeah, thank you, I appreciate it.
Hi there. I was wondering if you could speak a little to your sort of daily habits, process in writing that work for you.
Yeah, so yeah, my daily habits, oh gosh, what process? Unfortunately. I am not a creature of habit. My family, we joke that we're even terrible at like traditions. Like we'll do like one cool thing at Christmas one year and we'll be like, we should do this every year, and that we never do. And so it's a similar kind of thing with my writing process. No day looks the same. I am definitely not a write every day kind of writer. I have tried to be. I have tried to like sensibly get my 1,000 words a day. It just doesn't work for me. The one time I really did it and held to that routine, I ended up having to throw out everything I'd done. I have joked before that my books are born in the forge of flop sweat and absolute panic, because the deadline is crashing. It's an ADD thing. Like, it's like, not until I'm up against the wall can I see the path for some reason. Again, I'm trying to get better about that, just for my adrenal glands' sake, basically. My body's like, are we running from bears? No, we're writing books. But yeah, so my daily, what I'm working on now, what it kind of looks like for me now is I work really intensely for a very short amount of time. I am a weird author in that I really hate drafting. It's my least favorite part. I love when there is a draft that my editor can now, I would say like drafting, you're just throwing sand in the sandbox and then eventually you can make a castle out of it. I don't like throwing the sand in the sandbox. It's decision fatigue and all that. So yeah, I try to like block off. I'm like, okay, it's like this, like 2 months, 6 weeks. This is when I'm drafting. And then I go really hard, but even then I don't do every day a week. I really try not to ever work on weekends. Just again, for like nice work-life balance. Doesn't always work out. Like I used to have a thing where if my son was out of school, then I didn't have to write, but like that couldn't count during the summer. Like I have August deadlines, so I couldn't be like, but my kid's out of school. They're like, he's 17. Like what does that have to do with anything? But yeah, it's sort of like it just depends. I really like getting up super early to work, which is absurd, but again, another thing like the menial labor where I was like, oh God, if my process means I gotta get up at 5 a.m. because that's the only time I feel like I can work, even though this is my only job. But that really works for me for some reason. So yeah, it's a lot of like, and then I like to take big swaths of time off. I won't write for months at a time. Because I think it's very important to kind of let the well fill back up. Then I'm just trying to like be a person and travel and read and watch bad TV and cook and those kind of things. So, yeah, it's chaotic. Yeah.
Microphone's coming to you.
Can you tell us how you got your first book published?
Sure, yeah. So my first book was a YA novel called Hex Hall, and it came out in 2010. I was teaching high school English in 2008 was when I actually sold the book because we all live in the future in publishing. And I was teaching high school English. I had started reading a lot of YA as a result, and I was kind of like, this is really fun. You know, I would say I hadn't read much YA because I was growing up in the late 80s, early 90s. There just wasn't a lot of it. And so it wasn't until I was kind of working with like, you know, teenagers years later that I realized that YA had really changed. And so, yeah, it is the most like extremely pedestrian kind of, I wrote a book. I Googled like, how do you get a book published? And I learned a lot about how to query agents and things like that. I did, you know, I'm still with that agent that I landed for that first book. We are still together 15 years later. And then she, you know, was able to sell it, and then I was able to do this for a living, which was nice. But it's such a kind of bizarre thing, because I think sometimes there's this idea, and granted, this was like 15 years ago, so things may have changed now, but there can be this idea that you've sort of got to know the right people, or you've got to go to the right convention or conference or whatever, and network and all. I wrote my first book on a folding table in my bedroom in Harvest, Alabama, and cold queried agents like, I've made a book, do you guys want it? And it worked out, you know, so I think that, yeah, it was a very kind of simple process for me, which I'm very lucky, obviously, and it was a sort of right book at the right time. Yeah, I was writing a paranormal boarding school book when those were just going gangbusters. So yeah, it was really a simple process for me, which was nice.
Right here, there we go.
What is the point of writing under different names?
Oh yeah, that's a good one. People ask that a lot. Yeah, so yeah, I'm Rachel Hawkins, which is my actual government name. And then I am also Erin Sterling, which is my government middle name, truly. And it's honestly, in my case, it is a business thing. It's because when I sold the X-Hex, that romance, The Wife Upstairs had not yet come out. And so we didn't want to confuse people with like, what is Rachel Hawkins' adult debut? It's gotta be The Wife Upstairs because that's kind of what they bought, you know? And so we just needed to change it as a result for the romance because we'd already done The Wife Upstairs. It also, it's helpful. I mean, I'm not secret about it, clearly. I couldn't keep a secret if I tried, trust me. It's also like a thing where like Barnes & Noble doesn't go, a new Rachel Hawkins book, but we just ordered like, 40 Rachel Hawkins books. We don't need any more of her. And it kind of keeps the streams separate. So, and it's fun too. I love when people like come to a Rachel Hawkins event and I mention the Erin Sterling books and they're like, I didn't know that was you. That's really, it makes me feel like Superman. So that's nice.
One final question, maybe one right here.
Hello. So you talked about daydreaming and how thinking really helps you come up with your stories. But do you, when you're figuring out the major twists and turns in a thriller, is that more from the daydreaming, or is that like outlining and researching and figuring out that way?
Yeah, the twists and things do tend to come out more in the outlining. And I do outline, but I always say, like, it's not like an intense outline. It's, I used to teach English. It's not like the capital letters and Roman numerals and all that. It's literally, usually ends up being a 10 to 15 page document that's just the story in its simplest terms. And which again helps me then find those twists. And thank God, like the most recent book I just wrote, I was doing that, and I suddenly was like, oh my God, I've written incest. Oh no, hadn't realized it until it was, and I was like, what if I had been like 50,000 words into this book by going, wait, that makes them related. Oh my God, that makes them related. And so I was like, thank God I saw it in the outline. Sorry again. I took it out. And so yeah, so the twists and things definitely come in like the outlining. So the daydreaming is definitely like vibes, and then the outlining is where actual plot comes into play a lot more. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you to Rachel Hawkins.
Thank you guys so much.
Oh my gosh, you are hilarious. And if this writing thing doesn't work out, you have a really promising future in stand-up comedy. And you must have been an amazing teacher. So, you know, good for your students. We have Judy and Gary Latzenheiser to thank for bringing Rachel Hawkins today. So let's say thank you to them. And I know, as difficult as it's going to be, please, please, please cooperate in not corralling. Right, let her get to the tent in Telfair Square, and you can go visit her there. So, Rachel, thank you again. Brilliant.